My name's Henry Rowling. I'm the Director of Supporter Experience at the Children's Society. The Children's Society is a national children's charity that works across the UK. And my team are innovators, so we have 3 people working on innovation. We have 3 people working on insight, so the insight drives that innovation, and overall we're responsible for product development and innovation across our entire supporter engagement portfolio. So that is essentially finding new ways to interact with the general public, to engage them in the work of the Children's Society, either for their be campaigning or donating money to our work. You said it is a very broad concept, a very broad idea. There are numerous definitions that various people use. So for me, all it means is developing a new idea or product that people can interact with and add value to an organisation. So you take an idea, you take a piece of insight, you develop a new product through a process, a rigorous process, and that process we call innovation. So any organisation or any person in their day-to-day life, any business can use innovation to add value. However, if you haven't defined it, so if people aren't working from the same definition, then anything could come under the umbrella of innovation, and that's not healthy. So I think if it means different things to different people, in order for it to be the most effective it can be, you need one definition that everyone works to, and that's why I think it should be defined and it should be communicated. All departments, everyone should be aware of what your organisational definition of innovation is and what your process is, and that way it's the most efficient. So I would say that everyone's capable of having a good idea. However, those ideas need to have started from a market insight, a customer insight, some form of insight. So often people will say, we should be doing this, we should be doing that, and they might think that that is innovation. I would say it probably isn't. So the methodology we use at the Children's Society is that our starting point is always that there needs to be some form of insight that's either data-driven or so come from qualitative or quantitative data. Or it may be simply bits of research that you've undertaken with your customer segment or your audience segments. The basis of strong innovation is that you have a piece of insight that comes from either qual or quant, and then you work up through the process, through ideation, through piloting and prototyping and developing MVP, through to a product launch. So from my perspective, there's quite a big difference between having a good idea, which may seem good to you, but actually for the market is irrelevant or isn't starting from a piece of insight. And so I see the two as really quite different ideas, and often when someone comes to you with a good idea, in reality that idea may not be great. So I think what's right for one organisation may not be right for others. So it depends on, so it may be that an organisation or a company or a business says, we need to be more innovative, and this happens quite a lot at the moment. I would say, first of all, you need to work out why that is. What's the driving force? What's the market need? And if through that process your senior management and your leaders believe that that is something they should get behind, then you would need to go through the process of defining the innovation. If it is something that you want to throw yourselves into, then there'll be it may be that you want to disrupt your particular sector. It may be that you want your processes to be more innovative. So at the Children's Society we have 4 different levels of innovation that we consider to be effective. They don't all sit within our team, within the supporter experience team. So we believe that any team can be innovative in their processes and should be. So that would be looking at an existing process and trying to improve it. Teams that are product owners or campaign owners may wish to optimize those campaigns, and that would be a different form of innovation. So it really depends what's important for you as an organisation as to where you're going to focus your energies. And I think the concept of ownership is not necessarily helpful. It may be that you're subject matter experts and you are the internal experts. However, part of being an effective innovator, I guess, is to draw insights from outside of that organisation, and therefore if you say we own innovation within this business, that's quite an inward way of looking. So yes, I think you can have people who are internal experts, but they shouldn't want to own all of that work, because good ideas can come from all aspects. And really what you want to have a healthy business is for everyone to be involved in what are we doing day to day, can we do it better, is there something new that we can draw on from the outside world? And for me, that's a much healthier way of running things. Right. That so through, it may be that, you know, senior managers, senior leaders have come away from an away day and said we need more innovation, we need new products, you know, we're too static. Okay, absolutely fine. But often what will happen, especially if you're an intrapreneur, someone who's trying to innovate from within an organisation or business, then you need to absolutely have the right culture internally. So without that cultural fit, it's going to be really problematical when you try and bring new ideas to market. So a new idea, by definition, is untested, and therefore results are not guaranteed. And I think for me, the key part of trying to change a culture, an organisational culture, is to have agreement that failure is okay. So without that permission to fail, you're going to find it very hard to innovate to any effective degree. So at the Children's Society, we have different degrees that we're trying to bring change at. So, you know, we do have a focus on disruptive innovation, and that's kind of times 1,000 thinking. We have a focus on platform innovation, and that might be times 10. And so there are different gradations. And if you don't have the right culture within your organisation, then that's really going to be quite hard, especially if your directive is to really sort of shake things up and focus on that radical or disruptive area. So, you know, any kind of healthy, well-run organisation is going to be looking at their kind of risk register regularly to see sort of where the major areas are for them to be sort of concerned about. However, I think, you know, if you have a rigorous process for innovation, you can mitigate an awful lot of that risk. So if you are customer or data insight led, then you're already starting from a kind of consumer truth, and that to a degree helps mitigate some of that risk around I've got a good idea. So I think, you know, being insight led helps to mitigate some risk. Also, getting your idea into the marketplace at the lowest possible cost also helps to mitigate some of that risk. So if within your process you're looking at sort of minimum viable product, then you're not kind of gearing up to a £1 million launch where it's, hey, let's cross our fingers and hope this goes okay. So I think if you have a rigorous process that everyone's agreed and signed off on, then yes, by its nature, some elements of innovation will be risky, but there are absolute controls that you can put in place. It doesn't have to be completely expensive. I also think, depending on the size of the organisation, the risk levels will be slightly different. So I don't view that there's any kind of organisation that can or can't be innovative. I'd say everyone should at least attempt it with the right culture in place. But risk is absolutely something that can be managed and should be if you've got a well-defined process and some of those other elements are in place around MVP and piloting. I think that, as I said, it needs to be anchored in a kind of business truth. So there needs to be some reason why you're suggesting that this is a route forward. All businesses, organisations have limited resources, and effectively what you're saying is that we need to use some of our resources on this thing, and you need a good case for that. Why the organisation should be doing that rather than something else. If you don't have the support of anyone at a sort of more senior decision-making level, you're going to really struggle. So it may be that you're able to sort of silo yourself off and actually do some work on it without that senior sponsorship. However, when you have something to take to market or something that requires a more senior sign-off, they're simply not going to be on board. So I'd say if you don't have any sponsorship at a more senior level, you're really going to struggle to make that case. But really, the best way, the most effective way of changing an organisation's culture is to have a strong business case. So you need to have done the thinking around why we need to do this, paint the scenarios. If we don't do this, then this will happen, and really to have that strong business case as to why you should be doing what you're suggesting. I think if you've done that, you should, and you can find a senior sponsor within the organisation. I'd say test a little bit, try some things. It will be useful for you to have some success stories at other organisations, other businesses that will help to persuade people. I think having a strategy in most areas that you're working in is useful. I guess it's a written manifesto of what your sort of focuses are for the next 6 months. I think with the changing environment around us in society, a 5-year strategy is not necessarily fit for purpose. So you may spend 6 months writing a 5-year strategy that's then completely out of date within 6 months. So I would say yes, have a strategy broadly, and then review that on an ongoing basis. And also, I think as you learn through various things that you do within the organisation, you should take that learning and update your strategic focus. So what's relevant now today won't be relevant tomorrow. And that's why any kind of strategic process should be reviewed, I would suggest every 6 months. I think having a strategy helps give people that are working in that area a good focus. So if someone comes in new to the organisation, you can talk them through it and they know broadly what direction they're travelling in. If you don't have that document or whatever format it might be in, you could end up with people moving in different directions, and it's difficult to then point them in the same direction if you don't have that focus. I think if you're not making mistakes, you're not trying hard enough, and you're not pushing the envelope as far as you may need to. So I think we have a culture where mistakes and failure, especially within a kind of business world, within corporate world, mistakes are viewed often as someone's fault or a bad thing, and failure is just something that you shouldn't talk about. I don't think that's healthy, and actually that kind of thinking needs to be turned on its head. So it's unwise or unfavourable to keep making the same mistakes, but especially if you're trying to build something new, then not making mistakes, it's just not realistic to get something right every single time. You need that acknowledgement at a senior level that it's okay to fail. I think it would also be unwise if this is an emerging function within your business to overpromise. So as innovation settles within an organisation, there will be successes, hopefully, and failures along the way. And if you've overpromised, or if the organisation's pinning all its hopes on something working and it doesn't work, then again that's going to be really problematical. So I think that's an area that you need to focus on. I think it's likely that you will have some false starts, so you may try and your budgets may be too small. So I think setting a realistic budget for your innovation practices is really important, expenditure-wise and income-wise. You also need the rest of the organisation to understand what you're doing. So communication is really important. So other teams that you work with will have their day-to-day activity that they're involved in, and that may have different lead-in times. So if you need to take something to market quite quickly, that's going to rub up against your usual sign-off time. So I would say communication is really important, especially within senior stakeholders. So if you consider that anything that comes out of your innovation pipeline is likely to be untested and unproven, and therefore potentially quite risky to the organisation. I would say over communication with your senior stakeholders is very important. If you don't do that, at some point you're going to come unstuck. So when you're taking something to market and it may appear quite left field, senior members of staff, when they're signing off on this, are going to, it's going to be problematical at that stage. So I would say over communication across and up is fairly important. I think that there are quite a few, so people often think it is literally just coming up with a good idea and testing that idea, and that's going to make millions. I think that's seldom in reality what actually happens. Companies that have exploded over the last few years, organisations like Airbnb and Uber, are rooted in that customer insight. So yes, if you speak to the founders now, they had this great idea and then they just did this thing and then it just got massive and they can't believe it. Well, in reality, when you hear them interviewed in detail, that's very much not the case. So I think there's a myth around having just a good idea and then that'll solve all of your issues. I think there's a lot of kind of visually people think it's just going to be people kind of sitting around drinking a cappuccino, sitting on bean bags and then just doing some post-it note stuff. Some of that is a little bit true, but in reality there should be a really rigorous process behind going through innovation from customer insight. And so it's a discipline, and you need to be really disciplined in the way that you work, and there's a lot of failure involved, as well as potential rewards are high. And I think because there is that kind of myth around it, it's just kind of some cool people doing some cool stuff, and it's quite easy. I think those are the main things that you need to guard against. And if you take people through the process of how you're going to work, quite often they're like, oh, okay, there's more to it than we thought. Right. Yeah, so it would always start with the audience segments that you're hoping to develop new products or derive value for those audience segments. You need agreement on the fact that is where you're going to focus your energies. It's a lengthy process, so we try to work to, in our ideal scenario, you'd work to a 6 to 9 month time frame. Get agreement on what the audience or customer focus is, and then you develop some insight with those customers. So at the Children's Society, we've been doing quite a lot of customer insight, and that would involve things like WhatsApp diaries, focus groups, really getting under the skin of what that customer segment's interested in and how they live their lives. You then develop an insight deck that says this is an issue for this customer segment, and that's where we're going to focus our energies on developing new products. So you have your insights that are agreed. You then we run ideation sessions, and those would try and pull people from a diverse background into a room and come up with solutions to those problems. So you start from a truth around your customer segment and then say, okay, this is how our charity or our organisation could deliver value to this problem. You then come up from that with a whole host of ideas. So you might have 500 ideas of how you could deliver value for that customer segment. From that, you then shortlist, and then from the shortlist, you then develop new products, product ideas, then shortlist again, and then you might end up from those 500 ideas, maybe 3 or 4 different areas that you want to focus on. You then, depending on what your budgets were and your capacity within the organisation to deliver on those, you might say, okay, this is where we think the best chance is with this segment, and then look to develop an MVP, a prototype, as cheaply as possible, get it into the marketplace, test that idea. If it does well, then you might look to scale it and take it to a full-blown pilot. If not, you kill it and move on to the next idea. Within a company or a business or a charity, I don't think there's anything you couldn't apply the process to, because I think if you either look at a process and say this is the way that we've done it for 10 years, as quite often happens. And you could say, okay, so we know that we're doing this process and it's taking ages. Let's look at what's our insight. Okay, it means that our banking takes 10 weeks to do. Okay, so let's find a different way of doing it. You've got your insight, which is that it's taking 10 weeks to do, which is too long, and then go through that process, and you'll end up with something better at the end of it. So I believe, and I'm happy to have a debate or be proven wrong, but I think you can apply it in all facets of your business, in your life, whatever you want to do, where you're looking to have a more efficient process or to come up with a new product or idea. In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I think that the world has changed around the charity sector in the last 10 years, and we've been slow to react to some of the changes in the environment around us. But if you look at a lot of the founding stories behind organisations, they generally start with someone who sees a problem in society, wants to do something about it and does something quite radically different. So the Children's Society was started by a Sunday school teacher in 1881 who saw that children were being sent to workhouses, they sort of didn't have a home to live in, and started children's homes, and at the time that would have been viewed as quite a radical thing to do. So I think that charities often have radical or innovative solutions to societal problems at the heart of them. Over the last 10 to 15 years, I think within fundraising and engagement, due to the sort of demands to have reliable income streams, there's been a lot of focus on scaling things up that work. So if you look at direct marketing, direct mail, telephone, face-to-face fundraising, pressures come from the organisation to really maximise those channels. And I think the reliability of some of those channels prior to Olive Cook and subsequent media focus meant that organisations wanted to pump a lot of money into those channels and to have reliable returns. And I think that has led to innovation becoming stifled, certainly within fundraising and engagement of audiences. So I would say at the moment, over the horizon, the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a lot of focus on new product development, innovation, getting up to speed in the digital space for charities. So the last 10 years, there's been far too little focus on research and development in those areas. I think the sector also needs to diversify the people that come into it. So if you look at a lot of fundraising, marketing, communications departments, there is a lack of diversity within those departments, and that leads to a monolith of ideas that come out of it. So I think the sector needs to really look at how we draw in wider aspects of society and try and involve more of our beneficiary groups in developing some of the solutions. So I think there is a great potential within the sector to be more innovative, and that's where focus should be for the next 5 to 10 years. The charity sector is one of the only sectors that hasn't really been disrupted a huge amount so far, and I think some of the reason behind that is a lack of profit incentive, a lack of profit motive for some of the people who have disrupted some of those other sectors. So it's a really interesting question. I think the more that as a sector, as people that are interested in doing sort of social good, the more we should look to all sectors to draw in some of those expertise, those ideas, where the real energy is. And so I wouldn't say that we need to focus on one particular sector, but to be more open-minded about working with partners within some of those sectors to drive some new ways to engage people and new ways of delivering services for our beneficiary groups. I think that there's a whole plethora of work that needs to be done around service delivery. So I think the sector has delivered services with some notable exceptions in quite the same way for the last 10 years, and we need to be drawing on tech companies, about how we engage with some of our beneficiary groups. And I'd say again, that's a major area that the sector needs to focus on over the next 10 years. How do we actually really develop digital first solutions to a lot of the issues that our various beneficiary groups have in their day-to-day lives? I think if you question why you're doing some of the things that you do annually with a really kind of dispassionate cold heart, you may find that there are some things that aren't necessarily driving a lot of value for the organisation, and certainly may have diminishing returns. So some of the sort of sector regulation, the GDPR changes that have come in mean that you're going to get diminishing returns from things like telephone activity, direct mail, and sort of face-to-face engagement. So if you're brave enough to say, actually, we're going to stop some of those things, and it's only delivering small amounts of value to the organisation, especially if you factor in the amount of time spent developing some collateral, that will allow you to free up some headspace to start to look at new ways to engage people. So I think you have to make some difficult decisions around stopping products that are marginal. And once you do that, you're then freeing up the time of your staff in lots of different areas to then look at developing new things that may or may not work. Actually, the quick wins are fairly sparse. So I think there's lots of things you could become seduced by a sort of shiny new thing over in the corner, but actually if you genuinely want to commit to doing things in a different way, in a new innovative way, then that's a medium to long-term commitment. So I think if you becoming audience focused and insight led is a really interesting process, and I would urge all organisations to make that switch if you're not currently doing so. I don't think that's necessarily a quick win, and actually I don't believe there are a huge amount of quick wins in this area. Either you want to commit to it medium term, or you're going to carry on doing what you've always done, which may in the short term deliver more reliable results for you, but I believe will lead you down a path of diminishing returns and probable decline. Being insight-led, so getting involved in as much audience research as you possibly can. I think digital skills are at a real premium, and because of disparity in pay between what commercial organisation are prepared to pay for those skills and what we're able to pay within the sector, that's a big issue. I think coding skills, so digital coding skills are again a massive premium, and we don't have many within the sector. I think innovation, so if you have a process for innovation written down and understood within your organisation, it's something that everyone can do. So investing in some sort of training in that area is really important, and being data led as well. So insight can either be qualitative or quantitative, and you do need some of those quant skills within your organisation so that you can develop audience insight, which is the root starting point to most effective product development. Tech is not the solution, so it depends on what your insight is that you're starting from. Tech might be the solution, or it could be completely irrelevant. So I think that technology can be a great facilitator of the work that you do within your team. So there are lots of pieces of software that would be helpful to test an idea, and you can do sort of A/B testing relatively cheaply through technology. It shouldn't be just seen as the endpoint, the solution. So I would view technology as a facilitator, and it could be an accelerator in terms of where you end up, but it shouldn't be viewed as the end point. You don't have to work in a really high-tech environment in order to be innovative. So as we sort of discussed before, if you're looking at a process, so if you're if you're a housing association and part of your organisation has to go around fixing issues for tenants, then you can look at the process for doing that, and you can probably speed that up. That might be facilitated by technology, or it might not be. It might be a small tweak within that process. So I don't think you have to work in a high-tech environment to really kind of ace your innovation, and it really depends on what the insight is that you started with and what the end point is. So I think, you know, having some computers that work will probably help you in your process, but it doesn't have to be a sort of futuristic technology environment in order for you to excel at innovation. As we've sort of discussed at length, it's a process, and if you follow that process, then you should end up at a strong point at the end, and that may be facilitated by technology, or it may not. There's some sort of preconditions that you need to be aware of. So I think if you're thinking about becoming interested in doing things differently through innovation, you need to be very clear about who your audience is. So if you don't know anything about your audience, if you're not of the same mind of who your audience is, your core audience is, then you're going to struggle to innovate because most effective innovation is rooted in that audience insight. If you are clear about that, then you're meeting one of those preconditions. I think you need to know, have broad agreement on what your business issues are, what your main challenges are that your charity is facing. If you have that, I'd say that's a sort of secondary precondition. And then if you look at what you're currently doing and wonder if you could do things differently, and you might be able to speed up this process or engage these people in this way, and it's something you want to do new rather than maximising what you're already doing, I'd say that's probably the third precondition to meet. If you check on all three of those, then you're ready to get more involved in innovation.